Imagine walking into a holy place expecting peace but instead witnessing betrayal that turned into bloodshed. A respected pastor storms into his own church late at night only to find his wife and his own sister together in a way that shattered his faith and his sanity. What followed inside those walls was a scene so shocking that the entire community still struggles to talk about it. This is the story of the pastor who killed the two people he loved most inside the very church he built. Welcome back to the channel, where we uncover true crime stories that leave you questioning how well you really know the people around you. Today we are diving into the shocking case of a pastor who murdered both his wife and his sister after catching them together inside his own church. The details of this crime are disturbing, heartbreaking, and almost unbelievable. If you have not already, make sure you subscribe right now and join this community of viewers who refuse to look away from the darkest corners of human behavior. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that demands to be heard. And while you are here, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach and how many of you are tuned in from different parts of the globe. Now let us go back into the life of the man who was once praised as a shepherd of faith, but ended up as a murderer behind bars. This case takes us to Fort Wayne, Indiana, a place known for its quiet neighborhoods, brick churches on every corner, and families that had lived there for generations. In a city where Sunday mornings were sacred, Pastor David Johnson was more than just a preacher. He was seen as a man of integrity, someone who carried himself with the steady values of Midwestern tradition. His roots ran deep in Fort Wayne. His father had worked long hours in the factories that kept the city alive, while his mother was remembered for her kindness, her home-cooked meals, and her unwavering seat in the front pew of the church. When David rose to lead New Grace Baptist Church, the congregation welcomed him as the continuation of a legacy. Older members of the community often said he reminded them of the pastors they grew up listening to, men who were stern but loving, who made every sermon feel personal. His voice carried weight, his presence demanded respect, and his message was always centered on faith, family, and loyalty. To the outside world, Pastor Johnson seemed untouchable. He was the kind of man who appeared to live by the very words he preached. But beneath the calm image of a devoted pastor, the private storms of his home life were starting to gather, and soon the truth would tear everything apart. Pastor Johnson's wife, Rebecca, was a woman the community admired. She had a gentle way about her, the kind that made people feel welcome the moment they stepped into the church. She organized food drives, led the women's Bible study, and was often the smiling face newcomers first met when they walked through the church doors. To many in Fort Wayne, she was the perfect pastor's wife, supportive, faithful, and completely devoted to the church family. Rebecca's relationship with David's younger sister, Angela, seemed just as natural. Angela had grown up sitting in the same pews, singing in the choir, and learning under the same strict household as her brother. When Rebecca married into the Johnson family, Angela quickly became more than just a sister-in-law. She was a friend, a confidant, someone Rebecca could lean on when the responsibilities of being a pastor's wife grew heavy. The two women were often seen together, laughing in the fellowship hall after services, shopping at the local grocery store, or hosting Sunday dinners that filled the house with warmth and chatter. But behind the smiles, there were whispers that Rebecca and Angela shared a closeness that went beyond what most people expected. Some noticed the way their conversations grew quieter when others approached, or how they lingered together long after events had ended. At first, no one paid it much attention. After all, who would ever suspect anything improper between a pastor's wife and his sister? But in small towns like Fort Wayne, secrets have a way of pressing against the walls until they finally break free. Rebecca, despite her outward devotion, had begun to feel suffocated in her marriage. David's expectations were high, his standards unyielding, and his temper quietly simmered beneath the surface of his sermons. Angela, on the other hand, offered understanding, compassion, and companionship that David rarely showed at home. What started as late-night talks and shared frustrations slowly crossed the line into something forbidden, something that, if revealed, would destroy not just a marriage, but an entire community's faith in the man they trusted most. By the time the truth began to surface, the bond between Rebecca and Angela had grown too strong to ignore. They had convinced themselves that what they shared was love, even though it carried the weight of betrayal and danger. And as the nights passed, the risk of being caught grew higher. Neither of them realized that the very walls of the church that had once sheltered them would soon become the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. The New Grace Baptist Church in Fort Wayne was more than just a building. To the people of the community, it was a symbol of hope, a place where generations had gathered to worship, to mourn, and to celebrate life's milestones. Its tall white steeple could be seen from blocks away, rising above quiet neighborhoods and casting a shadow that seemed to watch over the city. Inside, the sanctuary smelled faintly of old hymnals and polished wood. The pews were worn smooth from decades of families kneeling and praying in the same spots. It was a place where silence often felt sacred, where even the smallest sound echoed, as though the walls themselves were listening. Late at night, the church carried a different kind of presence. Without the choir, without the Sunday crowd filling the air with voices, the space became heavy, almost haunting. The stained glass windows glowed faintly when the moonlight slipped through, casting colors across the walls that seemed to shift with every movement. The creak of the wooden floorboards sounded louder, the draft through the hallway colder. For anyone walking through those doors after dark, the church could feel less like a sanctuary and more like a place of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Rebecca and Angela had chosen the church as their hidden meeting ground. It was, ironically, the one place no one would ever think to question their closeness. To them, it felt private, safe, and away from the judging eyes of the community. They would sit in the very front pew, whispering in hushed voices, sometimes holding hands in the shadows, convincing themselves that they were careful, that no one would ever know. In those quiet moments, the church that belonged to David became theirs alone, a backdrop for their secret that grew bolder with each passing night. But what they didn't realize was that secrets can only stay hidden for so long. Pastor Johnson had grown suspicious. The late nights, the excuses, the way his wife avoided his questions. It all added up in his mind until he could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. He knew his church better than anyone, and he knew its corners, its doors, and its hiding places. One night, as the air outside grew colder and the streets emptied into silence, David made a choice that would change everything. He went back to the church, determined to confront the truth he feared the most. The heavy doors creaked open, and his footsteps echoed down the empty hallway. Every step he took drew him closer to the sound of muffled voices coming from inside the sanctuary. What he was about to see would not only destroy his marriage, but unleash a storm of rage that would leave blood on the altar and silence where there had once been prayer. The moment Pastor Johnson stepped into the sanctuary, the air felt heavier than usual. The faint glow of moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in scattered colors. He paused for a second, listening. At first, all he heard was the creak of the floor beneath his shoes. Then faintly, voices. Soft, hushed voices that didn't belong to a prayer meeting. His heart began to pound. He moved closer, careful not to make a sound, each step echoing like a warning in the hollow space. As he reached the front of the church, the whispers grew clearer, mixed with laughter, mixed with something far more intimate than conversation. His pulse quickened, anger rising inside him like fire. He pushed forward, and in that moment the sight before him froze him in place. There, in the front pew where he had preached countless sermons, sat his wife Rebecca and his own sister Angela, their closeness undeniable. They weren't praying. They weren't talking. They were wrapped in each other's arms, their secret laid bare in the very place he considered sacred. For a few seconds, the world seemed to stop. The pastor's chest tightened, his mind raced, and yet he could not believe what his eyes were showing him. This wasn't just betrayal. This was humiliation. In his church, under his roof, his wife and his sister had broken every bond of loyalty he had ever preached about. The weight of it crushed him in an instant. Years of sermons about sin, years of demanding purity from his congregation, shattered right there on the church pews. Rebecca's eyes widened the moment she saw him standing in the aisle. Her hand slipped away from Angela's, her mouth opening to explain, to beg, to calm, but it was too late. The silence in that sanctuary was heavier than any words they could have spoken. Angela froze, her face pale, her body trembling. Both women knew there was no excuse that could undo what he had just witnessed. Pastor Johnson's breathing grew louder, harsher, echoing in the hollow church. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as a storm of rage and betrayal consumed him. At that moment, Pastor Johnson was no longer the calm man of the pulpit. He was no longer the respected leader of New Grace Baptist Church. He was a husband betrayed, a brother deceived, a man stripped of everything he believed in. The sanctuary that had once been his place of peace had become the stage for his breaking point. And what came next would turn a place of worship into a crime scene that shocked Fort Wayne forever. The silence shattered as Pastor Johnson's voice thundered through the sanctuary. His words were raw, unfiltered, and filled with venom. He demanded answers, his voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. Rebecca tried to speak, but her words stumbled, breaking apart in panic. Angela sat frozen, her eyes wide, her body pressed back against the wooden pew as if she could vanish into it. The man who had once preached about forgiveness and mercy now stood before them, trembling with fury, his face twisted in a way neither woman had ever seen before. "In God's house," he spat, pointing a trembling hand at them. "In His house you bring shame to me, to my family, to this church." His voice echoed through the empty sanctuary like a sermon turned into a curse. Rebecca rose slowly, her hands outstretched as though she could calm him, as though she could explain away the unforgivable. "David, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. But every word only fueled the fire burning inside him. To him, there was no explanation, no excuse, only sin carved into the very pews of his church. Angela finally found her voice, her words tumbling out in a desperate plea. She tried to confess, to say they hadn't meant for it to happen, that it wasn't what he thought. But her brother's eyes burned with a rage that drowned out her voice. To him, every word was a lie, every sound an insult to the vows he had made before God and the trust he had placed in his own blood. Years of suppressed anger, hidden doubts, and unspoken frustrations erupted all at once inside that sanctuary. Rebecca stepped forward, reaching for his hand, tears streaming down her face. But the moment she touched him, something inside Pastor Johnson snapped. The betrayal was no longer just an image in his mind. It was a physical wound, and every gesture from her cut deeper. His breath grew heavy, his chest rising and falling as though he could barely contain the storm inside. The pulpit he once used to preach patience and love now stood behind him, powerless against the hatred consuming him. In that instant, Pastor Johnson was no longer a preacher or a leader. He was a man broken by betrayal, consumed by anger, and driven by the raw instinct to make the pain stop. The church pews bore silent witness as his rage transformed into action. What came next would forever stain the sanctuary with a crime so violent that even the most faithful members of his congregation would struggle to step foot inside again. The sanctuary that once echoed with hymns now filled with the sound of chaos. Pastor Johnson's fury boiled over as he lunged forward, his hands striking out in a storm of violence. Rebecca screamed his name, her voice piercing the night, but it did nothing to slow him down. Years of control and discipline crumbled in a single moment as his fists became weapons, driven by betrayal and rage. The pews shook under the force of his actions, and the sacred stillness of the church was shattered forever. Angela rushed forward, trying to pull him away, trying to protect her sister-in-law, but in doing so she sealed her own fate. His rage turned on her just as quickly. The betrayal of blood cut even deeper, and he lashed out with the same fury that had consumed him moments earlier. Her pleas for mercy echoed through the sanctuary, bouncing off the stained glass windows like cries no one could answer. The church, once a place of prayer, had become a trap where no salvation would come. Rebecca fought desperately, begging for him to stop, but every cry only fueled his anger. To Pastor Johnson, there was no wife anymore, no sister, only two people who had destroyed everything he had built, everything he had believed in. The pulpit stood silently in the background, the wooden cross above it casting shadows over a scene that would forever mark this house of God. And then, in a matter of minutes, silence fell again. The cries, the pleas, the struggle. It was all over. The two women who had once been closest to him lay still in the very place they had chosen for their secret. Pastor Johnson stood over them, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his brow. The church was silent once more, but the peace was gone, replaced by the haunting weight of death. He looked around at the sanctuary, the pews, the altar, the very symbols of his faith, and for the first time in his life he felt only emptiness. In that moment, he realized he had destroyed not just his family but his calling, his congregation, and his soul. And there was no undoing what had just been done. The church was silent, but it was no longer sacred. The walls that had once echoed with worship now seemed to close in on Pastor Johnson. He staggered back, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as he stared at what he had done. Rebecca lay still, her hand outstretched as if reaching for him one last time. Angela's body was motionless, her face frozen in fear. The man who had been their husband, their brother, their protector now stood over them as their killer. The sanctuary smelled of sweat, fear, and death, a place forever changed. Pastor Johnson dropped to his knees, clutching his head in both hands. He wept, but the tears brought no comfort. His cries echoed in the empty hall, raw and broken, a sound that seemed to mock the very sermons he had once preached about forgiveness and redemption. He whispered prayers, half begging for mercy, half cursing himself. But the silence gave him no answer. There was no voice from heaven, no light breaking through the stained glass windows, only the crushing reality that his life had just collapsed in the space of a few violent minutes. For a moment he tried to convince himself it hadn't happened, that this was a nightmare, that any second Rebecca would rise, brush the tears from her face, and speak to him softly the way she used to, that Angela would laugh and tell him it was all just a mistake. But the longer he stared, the more the truth sank in. They were gone. His wife, his sister, taken not by accident, not by illness, but by his own hands. The sanctuary seemed to grow colder as he stood. The cross above the pulpit loomed over him, casting its shadow across the pews. He walked slowly toward the altar, his shoes dragging on the wooden floor. He looked at the Bible resting open where he had left it after last Sunday's service. The words on the page blurred through his tears. Everything he had stood for, everything he had built, now felt like a lie. And deep inside, he knew the silence of that church would haunt him for the rest of his days. When Pastor Johnson finally left the church that night, he was no longer the man the community respected. Word of the tragedy spread quickly through Fort Wayne. Police sirens pierced the quiet streets as officers entered the church, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the horrific scene. The two women who had been loved and admired by the congregation were gone, and the man responsible was the very person they had trusted most. The sanctuary, once filled with prayer, was now a crime scene sealed off with yellow tape. The community was stunned. People who had once called him their shepherd wept openly in the streets, struggling to understand how the man who had preached love and forgiveness could be capable of such violence. Longtime members of the congregation recalled the sermons he had delivered about sin and betrayal, never imagining that he would become the embodiment of what he had condemned. The story spread beyond Indiana, making headlines across the nation. Fort Wayne was no longer known just as a quiet Midwestern city, but as the place where a pastor destroyed everything he claimed to stand for. The trial that followed was tense and emotional. Inside the courtroom, the same commanding voice that once filled a church with conviction was reduced to whispers and stammering answers. The prosecution painted him as a hypocrite, a man who allowed rage and jealousy to consume him. The defense tried to argue that betrayal had driven him to temporary madness, that he had acted in a fit of blind emotion. But the jurors saw the pictures from that night, they heard the testimonies, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. When the verdict was read, the courtroom sat in silence. Pastor Johnson was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, his reputation forever destroyed, his life sentence sealing his fate. The man who once stood in a pulpit lifted high by a community's trust was now led away in shackles. And as he disappeared through the doors of the courtroom, Fort Wayne was left with scars that would never fully heal. The case of Pastor David Johnson is one that still sends chills through Fort Wayne, Indiana. A man who was once trusted with guiding souls to peace instead left 2 souls lifeless inside the very church he called holy. It was a story of betrayal, rage, and destruction. A reminder that even the people we believe are strongest can crumble under the weight of secrets. For many in the community, the New Grace Baptist Church has never been the same. Some refuse to step inside again, saying the walls still carry the echoes of that night. Others try to move forward, but the memory of their pastor standing in handcuffs remains burned into their minds. Stories like this force us to question how well we really know the people around us. Behind the sermons, behind the smiles, behind the titles, there are human flaws, hidden weaknesses, and choices that can change everything in a single moment. The tragedy of this case is not just in the deaths of Rebecca and Angela, but in the way it shattered an entire community's trust. The man who once spoke of light and salvation had instead left them with darkness. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Was Pastor Johnson simply a man pushed to the edge, or was this an evil that had been building inside him for years? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing how far this community stretches and how many of you are tuned in to uncover these stories with me. If you found this story powerful and you want more cases like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These are the stories that remind us that evil can hide in plain sight, even in the places we trust the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and thank you for watching.